China's next-generation nuclear reactors are making the West nervous, and once you understand why, you'll realize this is one of the most consequential stories unfolding right now. China is completing a new nuclear reactor roughly every 3 weeks. You heard that right, every 3 weeks. To put that in perspective, the United States has commissioned just 2 new reactors in the last 30 years. 2. China is moving so fast, it's lapping the entire Western world before most people even knew the race had started. But this isn't just about who has the most reactors. It's about who controls the technology, the fuel, and the energy future of dozens of nations across the globe. While Western governments debate regulatory frameworks and watch billion-dollar projects collapse under their own costs, China is flipping switches on reactor designs that the West has only theorized about on paper. Designs that can't melt down. Designs that run on alternative fuels. Designs that float on water and generate power in the middle of disputed seas. Most people have no idea this is already happening, but it is. And to understand exactly how serious this gets, you need to start inside the reactor itself. The nuclear race no one's talking about. You've heard about the race to dominate AI. You've heard about the race to dominate space. But the race that could actually reshape the world's power balance is happening underground, inside reactor cores, and China is winning it. While the West has been distracted, China has quietly built the most aggressive nuclear expansion program in human history. Not decades from now, right now. As of today, China has over 20 reactors under active construction, more than the rest of the world combined. You heard that right, more than every other nation on Earth added together. This isn't a future threat, it's a present reality. But here's what makes this more than just an energy story. Nuclear power isn't simply about keeping the lights on. Whoever controls next-generation nuclear technology controls the energy infrastructure of the developing world. They control fuel supply chains. They control long-term geopolitical leverage. And right now, China is positioning itself to own all of it. The West built the original nuclear playbook, and China just rewrote it entirely. And the most alarming part? China isn't just building more reactors, it's building better ones. Reactor designs that are cheaper, safer, more efficient, and exportable to dozens of nations hungry for clean power. While the United States and Europe are still debating whether to approve new plants, China has already moved past the debate. It moved straight to construction. But this was just the beginning of the story, because to understand why these new reactors are so different, you first need to understand what's wrong with the ones we've been using for the last 60 years. How old reactors fall short. You probably think of nuclear power and immediately picture 2 things: limitless clean energy and catastrophic uncontrollable risk. Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima. Those names don't just represent accidents. They represent the moment public trust in nuclear power collapsed in the West and never fully recovered. That fear is exactly why Western nations started piling on regulations, freezing construction approvals, and watching their once dominant nuclear industries slowly stagnate. And with the reactor designs they were working with, that fear wasn't entirely irrational. Traditional reactors, the kind that have powered the world since the 1960s, depend on what engineers call active cooling systems. That means when something goes wrong, you need pumps running, backup generators firing, and trained humans making the right decisions under enormous pressure, all at the same time. Everything has to work perfectly, simultaneously, in a crisis. Fukushima showed the entire world what happens when it doesn't. One tsunami, one cascading power failure. And suddenly you have a disaster that took years to stabilize, billions of dollars to contain, and displaced over 150,000 people from their homes permanently. The coastline is still recovering today. But the safety problem was only half the crisis. The other half was money. Traditional reactors have become almost impossibly expensive to build in Western countries. The last 2 reactors completed in the United States at Plant Vogtle in Georgia came in at over $35 billion combined and ran more than 7 years behind schedule. You heard that right, $35 billion for 2 reactors. That's not a rounding error. That's a systemic failure of cost control so severe that it scared private investors out of the nuclear sector entirely. Without private capital, New projects depend completely on government backing, and governments that answer to voters who remember Fukushima aren't exactly rushing to write those checks. So the West built itself into a trap. Too afraid of the risk to push forward, too financially burned to pretend the economics worked, and too politically paralyzed to make a decisive move in either direction. Then came the question that changed everything. A new generation of reactor engineers stopped asking how to make traditional designs safer and started asking something far more radical. What if the reactor simply couldn't melt down? Not because of better safety systems, because of the physics itself. That question is exactly what China decided to answer, and what they built first is unlike anything the West ever got off the drawing board. The pebble-bed breakthrough, HTR-PM. Imagine fuel that looks like a billiard ball. Smooth, graphite-coated, about the size of your fist. Inside each one is a tiny core of uranium sealed inside multiple layers of ceramic material, so tough that even in a worst-case scenario, the radiation stays locked inside. Now imagine filling an entire reactor with 250,000 of these balls, stacked and slowly cycling through the core like a giant gumball machine. That is China's HTR-PM, the world's first commercially operating pebble-bed reactor, and it changes everything you thought you knew about nuclear risk. The HTR-PM went online in Shandong province in late 2023. It sounds simple, but what it represents is staggering. Unlike traditional reactors that require active intervention to prevent meltdown, the pebble-bed design is passively safe. If the cooling system fails completely, the reactor doesn't spiral into crisis. The physics just stop the reaction naturally. The fuel balls can't reach a temperature high enough to cause a meltdown. No pumps needed, no emergency intervention, no Fukushima scenario. The reactor cools itself. But the HTR-PM isn't just safer, it runs hotter than conventional reactors. That higher operating temperature unlocks something critical that old reactors could never do efficiently: industrial heat applications, and, most importantly, hydrogen production. You'll hear more about that later, and when you do, the full scale of what China is building will hit you all at once. The West has been theorizing about pebble-bed reactors for decades. Germany experimented with the concept in the 1980s and shelved it. The United States studied it and moved on. China took the blueprint, invested relentlessly, and became the first country on Earth to make it commercially real. And this was just one design on China's list. Because while the pebble-bed reactor was making headlines, something even more radical was being tested in the Gobi Desert, and almost nobody in the West was paying attention. Thorium Dreams, the TMSR, LF1. Most people have never heard of thorium. That's exactly the problem. Thorium is a mildly radioactive element that's 3 to 4 times more abundant in the Earth's crust than uranium. It can be used to generate nuclear power, and when it's used in a molten salt reactor, the results are extraordinary. Less long-lived radioactive waste. No risk of weapons-grade material being extracted, a fuel cycle that's far harder to weaponize. And a reactor that operates at atmospheric pressure, which eliminates one of the biggest catastrophic failure risks in conventional nuclear design. In 2023, China completed the TMSR, LF1, a thorium-based molten salt reactor built in the Gobi Desert. It's a 2-megawatt experimental system, not yet a full commercial plant. But that's not the point. The point is that China built it, tested it, and is already planning a larger follow-up. While Western researchers are still writing academic papers about molten salt reactors, China poured concrete and started collecting real operating data. Here's where the tension builds. Thorium fuel cycles could eventually reduce China's dependence on imported uranium, a supply chain vulnerability that Western nations have quietly used as leverage for years. If China masters thorium reactors at scale, it doesn't just gain cleaner energy, it gains energy independence on a level no other nation has achieved. And it gains a technology it can export to countries that also have abundant thorium reserves, countries in South Asia, Africa, and South America that are desperate for energy and increasingly open to Chinese partnerships. Then came the most critical realization of all. Thorium isn't just a fuel, it's a geopolitical unlock. A nation that masters thorium reactors doesn't just produce power, It reshapes the entire global nuclear fuel economy. And China already has a running head start. But the Thorium program is only one piece of what China is preparing to sell to the world. Because the real global expansion play isn't experimental, it's already commercially packaged and shipping. Hualong One, China's export machine. You want to understand how China turns nuclear technology into global influence? Look at the Hualong One. It's China's flagship third-generation pressurized water reactor, fully designed, fully certified, and actively being sold to countries across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Pakistan already has Hualong One units operating. Argentina has signed on. Multiple nations across the global south are in active negotiations. China isn't just building reactors at home, it's exporting the entire infrastructure package. Here's what makes the Hualong One so effective as an export product. China doesn't just sell you a reactor. It offers financing through state-backed loans, construction through Chinese firms, fuel supply agreements, and long-term operational support. For a developing nation with massive energy needs and limited capital, that's an offer almost impossible to refuse. You get clean power, you get infrastructure, and you get a long-term energy partner who also happens to be your creditor. The West sees exactly what this is. Every Hualong One that gets built in a developing nation is a decades-long relationship locked in maintenance contracts, fuel dependencies, technical training pipelines, political goodwill. It's energy infrastructure as soft power, packaged so cleanly that recipient nations often don't feel the strings attached until they're already connected. But this was just the beginning of China's export ambition. Because the Hualong One is a large, traditional-scale reactor, and China knows the next frontier of nuclear exports isn't large. It's small, modular, and deployable almost anywhere on Earth. Small reactors, massive ambitions. Forget everything you picture when you hear the word nuclear plant. The towering cooling towers, the massive construction footprint, the decade-long build timeline. Small modular reactors, SMRs, throw that entire image out. These are compact, factory-built reactor units that can be assembled on site, scaled up by adding more modules, and deployed in locations where a full-scale plant would be impossible. China isn't just researching them. It's racing to commercialize them faster than anyone else on Earth. China's ACP-100 is one of the most advanced SMR designs currently in development, a 100-megawatt unit designed for modular deployment, lower upfront costs, and faster construction timelines. But China didn't stop at land-based SMRs. It built something that genuinely has no Western equivalent, a floating nuclear power platform. The ACPR-50S is a reactor mounted on a marine vessel capable of providing power to remote coastal regions, island territories, and offshore industrial operations. China has already deployed floating platforms in the South China Sea, an area where it has significant territorial ambitions. You heard that right, nuclear power, floating, in disputed waters. The strategic implications hit harder than most analysts want to admit publicly. A floating reactor isn't just an energy solution. It's a mobile infrastructure asset that extends China's operational reach into regions where conventional power grids don't exist. It makes Chinese presence in remote maritime zones self-sustaining. And it does it all under the banner of clean energy development. Then came the realization that shook Western defense analysts' energy infrastructure and military strategy had just quietly merged, and China had already launched the vessel. But SMRs and floating reactors are only part of what makes China's nuclear program uniquely threatening to Western dominance. Because the highest temperature reactors China's building don't just produce electricity, they unlock an entirely different industrial future. Heat, hydrogen, and industry. Here's something most people don't know about. Nuclear power electricity is actually one of the less exciting things a reactor can produce. The real prize is heat. Specifically, very high temperature heat, the kind that conventional reactors can't efficiently generate, but China's next generation high temperature gas-cooled reactors can. And what you do with that heat changes everything. Industrial processes, steel manufacturing, chemical production, cement, refining, account for roughly 20% of global carbon emissions. These industries don't run on electricity. They run on intense, sustained heat. Right now, That heat comes almost entirely from burning fossil fuels. There is no clean alternative at scale. Except, potentially, a high-temperature nuclear reactor sitting next to the factory. China's HTR-PM operates at outlet temperatures approaching 1700 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, you can drive thermochemical reactions that split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen, producing clean hydrogen at a scale and cost that no other method currently achieves. Hydrogen is the fuel the world desperately needs for heavy transport, industrial heat, and long-duration energy storage. And China is building the reactor type most capable of producing it cheaply. But this was just the beginning of the industrial pivot. Because once you pair high-temperature reactors with hydrogen production at national scale, you don't just have a clean energy solution. You have a reindustrialization strategy, one that could allow China to decarbonize its manufacturing base while simultaneously building the export infrastructure to sell that capability to the world. The West is still debating hydrogen strategies. China is already building the reactors to deliver them, locking down the fuel chain. Every reactor needs fuel, and whoever controls the fuel controls the reactor for decades. China understands this better than anyone, and it's been quietly executing a global resource strategy that most Western governments are only now beginning to fully grasp. This isn't just about building reactors. It's about owning every single link in the chain that keeps them running from the mine to the fuel rod to the spent waste facility. And China has been building that chain, country by country, contract by contract, for over 20 years. China has secured uranium mining agreements across Kazakhstan, Namibia, Niger, and Canada. It has invested heavily in domestic uranium processing and enrichment capacity, systematically reducing its dependence on Western enrichment services that could be cut off under sanctions or political pressure. It is also the world's leading investor in thorium research, giving it a potential pathway to a fuel cycle that requires almost no imported material at all. Piece by piece, China has been assembling total energy self-sufficiency while simultaneously positioning itself as the supplier that other nations will depend on. But here's where it gets deeply alarming. Several African nations that have signed nuclear cooperation agreements with China also happen to sit on significant uranium reserves. The deals are framed as development partnerships, infrastructure investment, energy access, economic growth. In practice, they lock in long-term fuel supply relationships that flow directly back to Beijing. By the time those reactors need refueling 20 or 30 years from now, the supply chain is already Chinese. The dependency is already built in. There's no exit ramp. Then came the detail that Western energy strategists couldn't ignore. China wasn't just securing fuel for its own reactors. It was engineering a system where every reactor it exports comes bundled with a long-term fuel dependency. One technology sale becomes one construction contract, becomes one fuel agreement, becomes one nation pulled permanently into China's energy orbit. It's a strategy so methodical and so patient that by the time the consequences became visible, the architecture was already in place. And the West had spent the last 2 decades watching it happen without a coherent response. Why the West is falling behind? You might be wondering, where is the United States in all of this? Where is France, the country that once led the entire world in civilian nuclear power generation? The answer is uncomfortable, and it's not a technology problem. It's not a funding problem either. It's a systemic failure so deep that it has taken an entire generation to fully surface. The West didn't lose the nuclear race because it lacked the engineers or the science. It lost it because it built institutions that make forward progress nearly impossible and then convinced itself that was responsible governance. In the United States, licensing a new reactor design through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission takes anywhere from 10 to 20 years under normal conditions. Construction costs have become so volatile and unpredictable that private capital will not touch new nuclear projects without massive, sustained government guarantees. The last major reactor project completed in America, Plant Vogtle in Georgia, finished over 7 years behind schedule and landed at over $35 billion, more than double its original cost estimate. You heard that right, double. And that's not an outlier. That is the pattern. Every large Western nuclear project of the last 2 decades has followed the same arc: delayed, over budget, and politically bruising. France, which once generated over 70% of its electricity from nuclear power and was the global standard-bearer for civilian nuclear expertise, has watched its aging reactor fleet deteriorate, while new construction stalled under compounding cost overruns and regulatory paralysis. The United Kingdom's Hinkley Point C project has hemorrhaged billions beyond its original budget and keeps pushing its completion date further into the future. Europe's much-hyped nuclear renaissance, announced with genuine optimism in the early 2000s, quietly collapsed under its own institutional weight before a single new reactor was finished. But this was just the surface of the collapse, because beneath the regulatory failures and the budget disasters lies something far more damaging: a generational hemorrhage of expertise. When a country stops building reactors for 20 or 30 consecutive years, something irreversible happens. The engineers retire. The specialized supply chains dissolve. The contractors pivot to other industries. The institutional knowledge that took decades to accumulate simply walks out the door, and it does not come back easily, or quickly, or cheaply. You cannot restart a nuclear industry the way you restart a factory. The tacit knowledge, the hands-on experience, the deeply specialized workforce, that ecosystem takes generations to rebuild once it's gone. China never stopped building, not for a single decade. While the West was frozen in regulatory debate and political hesitation, China was training engineers, developing supply chains, refining construction techniques, and accumulating the kind of real-world operational data that no research paper can replicate. That gap in continuous experience is now so wide, it cannot be measured in years. It's measured in entire reactor generations, and China is already 2 generations ahead. Who wins the energy order? Here's where everything lands. You've seen the reactors. You've seen the fuel strategy. You've seen the exports, the floating platforms, the hydrogen ambitions, and the crumbling Western response. Now step back and look at the complete picture, because what China is assembling isn't just the world's most aggressive energy program. It's the infrastructure of a new global order. And it's being built right now, while most of the world is focused somewhere else. If China successfully scales next-generation nuclear reactors before the West meaningfully catches up, the consequences don't stay contained to the energy sector. They cascade across geopolitics, economics, and international alignment in ways that will define the next 50 years. Dozens of developing nations will run on Chinese-built reactors, fueled by Chinese uranium, maintained by Chinese engineers, monitored by Chinese software, and financed by Chinese state banks. Their energy systems will be structurally bound to Beijing for half a century or more. That is not a trade relationship. That is dependency. And dependency, at that scale and duration, is the most durable form of geopolitical leverage that exists. Meanwhile, the nations that want to align with Western energy systems will face a choice that gets harder every single year. The West delays, pay more, wait longer, navigate decades of regulatory uncertainty. Or take the Chinese offer that's already sitting on the table, fully engineered, competitively priced, state-financed, and ready to break ground within months. For energy-hungry nations across South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that choice has an increasingly obvious answer, and China knows it. But then comes the layer that makes Western governments genuinely lose sleep. If China's high-temperature reactors enable the mass production of cheap green hydrogen, and China deploys that capability first at industrial scale, it doesn't just win the clean energy transition. It wins the future of manufacturing itself. Steel production, chemical synthesis, cement, heavy freight, shipping. All of it is moving toward a hydrogen-based economy. Whoever builds the cheapest, most reliable hydrogen production infrastructure first will set the economic terms for every industry that follows. And right now, China is the only country actively building the reactor type most capable of delivering that hydrogen at scale. The nations that lock in that infrastructure first will not just have cheaper energy. They will have structurally lower costs across every energy-intensive industry, a permanent economic advantage baked into the foundation of their industrial base. Everyone else will be paying a premium to compete. China started this race quietly, methodically, and decades before the moment the West finally looked up and noticed. The pebble-bed reactor is already generating power in Shandong. The molten salt reactor has already run in the Gobi Desert. The Hualong One is already operating on 3 continents. The floating platforms are already deployed. The fuel agreements are already signed. And while Western governments are still commissioning feasibility studies and debating regulatory reform, China is already building whatever comes after all of that. The reactors are running. The strategy is executing. And the window to respond is closing faster than most people realize.